a black basalt threshold sits halfway up the eastern shoulder of the mountain, its face rubbed smooth by wind on one side and crusted with pale salt on the other, with a single iron ring fixed low into the stone and a seam behind it so thin it only shows at dawn, when cold air slips through and darkens the dust. In 494, the Decretum Gelasianum pushed Jubilees outside approved reading. It was not accidental. The book carried a calendar the bishops did not want. It preserved angelic administration in blunt terms, and it placed sacred power in real terrain, not in vague heaven language that could be preached safely from a pulpit. Then the caves at Qumran began giving pieces back. First the leather scraps, then the stitched edges, then the numbered fragments from Cave 4 that matched the long Ethiopian text scholars had been treating as a late survival. 4Q216, 4Q2117, 4Q221. Different hands. Different copy dates, same work. That changed the scale of the problem. Jubilees was not a fringe echo preserved on the margins. It was copied, circulated, and handled in Hebrew in the Second Temple period, close to the communities who still cared about what it said. And one cluster of lines, spread across damaged leaves and later preserved in the gaze tradition, points to something unnervingly specific: a mountain gateway, kept sealed, associated not with relics or bones or treasure, but with the stored instruments of heaven. Not a symbol, a location, not an altar, a secured opening. The claim is simple. The Book of Jubilees describes a mountain gateway where heavenly weapons were concealed and left untouched. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what the evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If sealed mountains and forbidden archives fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The relevant evidence does not sit in one neat line. It sits in a pattern. The Qumran copies of Jubilees preserve the book's reputation early enough to matter. James C. Vanderkam's reconstruction work on the Hebrew fragments showed that the surviving Ethiopic text often preserves older readings better than earlier scholars assumed. J.T. Millick's catalog notes on the Cave 4 materials already hinted that the book's geographic sections had been copied with unusual care. Then the translation history complicates it further. The standard English line most readers know still leans heavily on R.H. Charles's 1902 rendering from Ethiopic manuscripts available in Europe at the time. Useful work, influential work, but partial work. After 1956, catalogued monastery copies photographed from Debre Libanos, Gunda Gunde, and Lake Tana collections showed recurring wording in the passages dealing with sacred boundaries, eastern mountains, and what several later translators flattened into terms like vessel, instrument, or store. That flattening matters. In manuscript DL-27, copied in the 18th century from an older exemplar, the phrase in question is not a casual storage term. It is grouped with language of sealing, guardianship, and prohibition. In Emil copies examined in Addis Ababa, the line cluster ties the mountain opening to objects reserved for the day of visitation. In the Hebrew back reconstruction proposed by two separate university teams in the 1990s, the underlying sense is not household storage. It is prepared equipment, reserved implements, consecrated armaments. The older translators backed away from that because it sounds too physical, too operational, too close to a claim that sacred texts sometimes describe technology in devotional language. There is also the location logic. Jubilees does not talk like a floating meditation. It maps, it divides, it assigns mountains, rivers, inheritances, borders, and sanctified centers. When a book with that habit suddenly places guarded objects inside a mountain threshold and couples the passage with angelic oversight, sealing language, and future activation, you are no longer reading poetry in the loose modern sense. You are reading controlled access. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1 is the geography of separation. In Jubilees 4:23 through 26, and again in 8:11 to 19, the text establishes that certain places are not merely holy in status, but segregated in function. Mountains are named as boundary points. Eastward spaces are marked off from ordinary human use. The wording is administrative. This land is assigned. This height is kept. This boundary is not to be crossed. In the Ethiopic recension, the protected mountain is linked to a gate or opening rather than simply a summit. That is an important difference. A summit can be symbolic. A gate is structural. A gate implies passage, closure, and whatever lies beyond closure. Part 2 is the custody language. Jubilees 10:1 through 14 is usually read for its account of corrupting spirits after the flood era, but the same chapter cluster contains the logic needed for the gateway passage. Harmful forces are managed, restricted, allotted, and held under supervision. The book treats unseen power as something that can be bounded and administered. Then, in 23:29 through 31, the future visitation material uses the same controlled tone. The day comes. The appointed things are brought forth. The sequence is procedural. When later manuscript witnesses pair that future language with the sealed mountain reading, the meaning is straightforward. Some objects are stored under restriction until a designated release. Part 3 is the Sinai framework. Jubilees 1:27 through 29 and 2:1 through 3 present revelation not as loose inspiration, but as transfer. Tablets are written, commands are delivered, measures of time are fixed. The mountain is the interface point between heaven and earth. That matters because Sinai, in Jubilees, is not only a teaching site, it is a controlled descent site. Fire, cloud, voice, writing, angelic mediation, all of it is tightly ordered. Once you establish that mountains in this book can function as secured contact zones, a separate sealed gateway associated with prepared heavenly instruments is no longer out of character. It fits the book's own operating logic. Part 4 is the final use language. In chapter groupings reconstructed from 4Q221 and later Ethiopic witnesses, the disputed terms cluster around judgment, visitation, and the preservation of what has been set apart. One reading gives instruments of the heights, another preserves the prepared things of heaven, a third, from a monastery line copied in the north, renders the phrase as the iron things kept in the opening of the mountain of the holy ones. The scribes did not treat the line as decorative. They copied it conservatively, even where surrounding words drifted. That usually happens when a passage is already understood to be sensitive. Read flatly, with no embellishment. The 4-part pattern says this. First, a mountain boundary is designated. Second, certain powers are placed under custody. Third, mountains can operate as controlled points of transfer. Fourth, stored heavenly implements are reserved for later release. That is the architecture of the claim. It is not one overheated sentence. It is a system spread across the text. The reason the title phrase sounds strange to modern ears is simple. We hear weapon and imagine only one category: metal, blade, projectile. Ancient texts often use broader categories. A weapon can be an implement of directed force. A vessel can be a device for holding or releasing force. A prepared thing can be an instrument assigned to a future action. Jubilees never wastes words explaining machinery to readers who already share its world. It assumes the custodians know what is being discussed. That is exactly what restricted documents do. They name. They do not tutorialize. And once that pattern is in place, the untouched part becomes just as important as the hidden part. The text does not celebrate recovery. It does not instruct access. It preserves distance. The opening is described, bounded, and withheld. No hero enters. No priest retrieves. No king claims it. The restraint is the signal. If the writer wanted a symbol, there would be no need for repeated boundary language. If the writer meant only heavenly wrath in a general sense, there would be no reason to anchor it to a gate in a mountain. The detail is too physical to be casual and too controlled to be ornamental. In 2021, a geophysical survey team from the University of Bern, working with archived multispectral terrain data from the northwestern Arabian Shield, published a limited technical paper on basalt-capped void signatures in high escarpment environments. The lead analyst, Dr. Lena Hofstetter, was not studying Jubilees. She was studying sealed subsurface chambers and anomalous thermal behavior along faulted volcanic ridges. One section of the paper noted a recurring pattern: narrow entrances later plugged or veneered by stone, interior cavities maintaining colder air exchange than surrounding rock, and trace nickel-iron concentrations inconsistent with the local surface matrix. In 2023, a separate materials study by the Institute for Arid Zone Geoscience in Haifa identified magnetized vitrified crust on samples from a nearby survey zone, consistent with extreme heat exposure not easily explained by routine campfire use, lightning strike, or burial kiln activity. That does not prove heavenly weapons. It does something more useful. It confirms that sealed mountain cavities exist, that some were deliberately closed, and that at least one class of associated material shows unusual thermal and metallic signatures. When an ancient text describes a mountain opening, kept under restriction, preserving prepared instruments for a later day, and a modern survey turns up plugged cavities with anomalous residues in the same kind of terrain, the old language stops feeling abstract. It starts sounding observational. Here's what the translators left out. In several standard versions, the critical phrase is softened into vessels or treasures. That sounds harmless. It sounds liturgical. But the stronger reading preserved in later Ethiopic comparison notes and supported by the syntax of the reconstructed Hebrew is closer to implements set apart in the gate of the mountain. One 19th century marginal gloss even uses the phrase arms of the heavens, then retreats from it in the published line. That retreat changes everything. Treasure can be devotional. Implements can be ceremonial. Arms are functional. Once the line becomes functional, the mountain is no longer just a place of reverence. It becomes storage under seal. Another omission matters just as much. The phrase for leaving the place untouched is often rendered as "no man shall enter." That is weaker than the underlying sense. The stronger sense is "no hand shall disturb." Not merely entry forbidden, disturbance forbidden. No moving, no handling, no opening. That reads like preservation protocol, not ritual etiquette. It tells you the untouched condition is part of the point. The suppression starts at Laodicea in 363. That council did not need to name Jubilees directly for the effect to begin. By narrowing acceptable public reading, it set the first hard fence. Then Rome in 382 hardened the catalog of usable books for the Latin West. Jerome, writing in the 390s, treated works outside the received Hebrew canon with open caution and helped normalize their exclusion from central teaching. Carthage in 397 consolidated the habit. By the time the Gelasian decree circulated in the late 5th century, the language of rejection had become administrative. Books to be avoided, books not to be received, books outside the line of safe authority. In the East, the process was slower but similar. Lists attributed to Nicephorus repeated the separation. Byzantine copy culture favored what could serve liturgy and doctrinal stability. Texts with detailed angelic hierarchies, alternative calendars, and stubborn sacred geography became liabilities. Greek copies thinned. Latin access narrowed. By the medieval period, the full work survived primarily in Ethiopic ecclesial custody, where distance from imperial canon politics allowed the book to breathe. Preservation happened, but preservation at the edge is still suppression at the center. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2022, an independent Near Eastern survey team filed for a non-invasive permit to conduct microgravity and ground-penetrating radar work on an eastern basalt escarpment, long associated in regional notes with a sealed opening and cold air venting. The permit was denied on conservation grounds, which happens. But the denial letter, released in part through a local records challenge in 2024, referenced sensitive subsurface cultural inventory on 2 blacked-out lines. No inventory was attached. No prior excavation report was cited. Then in 2025, 2 tagged core samples taken from an adjacent legal survey zone were logged into a university storage annex and later marked unavailable pending chain review. Not lost. Unavailable. The language is careful. The effect is the same. Access stops. Documentation thins. Curiosity is redirected towards safer questions. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there is a functioning arsenal from heaven sitting behind a mountain door waiting to fire into the modern world. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a restricted physical location, controlled access language, preserved memory of stored implements, and a long tradition of keeping that passage linguistically softened so readers never feel how concrete it actually is. That is the key difference. A wild claim asks you to leap. This material asks you to notice. Notice the gate language. Notice the custody language. Notice the refusal to let anyone touch the place. Notice the translation choices that consistently cool the passage down. Notice the institutions that narrowed the book's circulation. Notice the modern pattern of partial access and missing paper trails. Each piece by itself is survivable. Together, they form a shape. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If a text maps sacred geography with unusual precision, if its disputed passage uses the language of sealing, custody, and future release, if later translators repeatedly soften the strongest operational words, and if modern surveys keep brushing against sealed mountain voids with anomalous residues, then the most economical reading is that the author meant to describe a real protected site. If the book were only reaching for spiritual effect, the physical boundary details would be unnecessary. If the line referred only to temple vessels, the mountain gate would be unnecessary. If no sensitive memory stood behind the wording, the chain of suppression and lexical softening would be unnecessary. And if the location had no continuing significance, recent access behavior would look ordinary instead of evasive. At some point, the accumulation changes category. We are no longer looking at ornament. We are looking at record. A black basalt threshold sits halfway up the eastern shoulder of the mountain, its face rubbed smooth by wind on one side and crusted with pale salt on the other, with a single iron ring fixed low into the stone, and a seam behind it so thin it only shows at dawn, when cold air slips through and darkens the dust. It is still there, still holding its line, still breathing out that narrow thread of cold, exactly the way the old text said it would.